morning. My name's David Kenner. I'm an instructor with the Bloch School of Business Management. And today I've got Anthony Martinez with me. He is a partner with the law firm of Hardy and Bacon in Kansas City. He received his JD cum laude from the University of Arkansas, where he served on the Arkansas Law Review, and his BSBA, also from the University of Arkansas, with a major in economics. After law school, he held the prestigious position as a clerk for the Honorable Justice Tom Glaze of the Arkansas Supreme Court. Anthony's litigation practice is broad, covering the defense of claims involving toxic torts, nuisance, OSHA, environmental, and products liability. Included within these claims, of course, are numerous ones involving premises liability, which is what we're going to discuss today. As businesses open up, what responsibilities do they have to keep their customers, patrons, invitees, and licensees safe from infectious diseases, such as those arising from COVID-19? So, Anthony, what liabilities do property owners or tenants have if someone comes onto their property and subsequently acquires COVID-19, whether it's a tenant's employee, guest, invitee, or licensee?
So for most of these cases, whether it's premise liability or a negligence type case, the main inquiry is going to be did the owner know or have reason to know that there was a dangerous condition that existed on their property? Now, normally in a typical premise liability case, this is, an icy patch or a stump or some type of metal piece sticking out of the ground. Well, here it's COVID-19. And I think the analysis is changing every day, right? Because when COVID-19 started, it was a new phenomenon. I think you had an excuse as a property owner that, you didn't really know what was going on. It was so new, there wasn't much literature or guidance out there. But now we all know what COVID-19 is. As you start to reopen your business, there's plenty of guidance out there, whether it's from the CDC, whether it's from OSHA, whether it's state or local, to let you know that, hey, this is an issue. You need to protect your customers, you need to protect your employees, you need to protect your vendors as they come in. So I think from the starting point there is it's going to be difficult for any property owner to say they didn't know or have reason to know that COVID-19 was a dangerous condition. So the next question is going to be, what'd you do about it? As we mentioned previously, there's a lot of guidance out there right now, and it's changing every day. So the best sources to go to are CDC's website, OSHA's website. If you have trade organizations, whether it's a restaurant or anything like that, even FDA has some guidance regarding reopening restaurants. You need to check those on a weekly basis to make sure that you're in lockstep with what's going on. And when you do that, whether it's putting signs up, whether it's requiring patrons or employees to wear masks, those are all considerations you need to take to make sure that you're making the best potential argument down the road if somebody does get COVID-19 and tries to sue you and make you liable for their COVID-19.
Now, does the type of property matter, whether it's, say, office, retail, industrial, or multifamily?
From a legal standpoint, it doesn't. But from a practical standpoint, it's again going to go to that knowledge. Did you have reason to know, and what action did you take? A hospital is going to be much different than an accountant's office who doesn't have as much traffic. Everybody still needs to take the necessary precautions, but depending on what you are you a dentist who puts their hands in patrons' mouth every day? Or are you just, like I said, an accountant who maybe sees one or two people in person a day? The rest of your stuff can be done over the phone or virtually. So from a legal standpoint, it doesn't matter. From a practical standpoint, the considerations will matter.
What about homeowners? Do they have a similar responsibility?
They do. Homeowners are under premise liability are treated just like a business owner. Again, it's going to go to, did they have reason to know that the dangerous condition existed on their property? So here, do you know whether your kids have COVID-19? Do you know whether your grandparents who may visit on a weekly basis have COVID-19? Have you been at work and you've been notified that somebody had COVID-19? So, think about your maid coming on your property. Maybe you have somebody who comes and helps cook on your property. Maybe somebody came in and did some construction work on your property. If you had reason to know that COVID-19 existed on your property and you didn't tell those people, you may be liable.
What kind of proof would be required for a potential plaintiff to demonstrate causation? In other words, that they acquired COVID-19 at this specific property. How difficult is this proof going to be for someone to prove that they acquired COVID-19 from a particular piece of property?
And that's going to be the real, I think, issue when it comes to COVID-19 liability for the most part, is proving causation. It's going to be really difficult to do it. But if you have clusters, say, take the Great Clips example. I don't know if you heard about that down in southern Missouri. There was a Great Clips where a couple of the barbers there tested positive. Somehow nobody got COVID-19 from that. Part of that was they had good guidelines in place. They required patrons to wear masks. The barbers wore masks. They probably had proper cleaning. But just think if the barbershop down the street had an outbreak, right? It may be easier, but they didn't require masks. They didn't follow necessary guidelines. It may be easier to prove causation there because they can say, hey, look, Great Clips down the street did all this stuff. They didn't have an outbreak. You had an outbreak. 10 or 20 customers from your place got COVID-19. You don't require them to wear a mask. You don't have proper cleaning after each customer. You don't do temperature checks. So I think that's really going to be the kicker is, are there clusters? Are there clusters of customers who got sick? And then two, what guidelines did you follow to prevent that?
Now, would a tenant's employees, guests, invitees, or licensees be treated differently for liability purposes?
An invitee or guest are basically the same thing. And so it's going to be, did the dangerous condition exist on the premise? And did you know or have reason to know? Whereas a licensee or like a vendor, it's a little bit more stringent of a requirement under the law. I think it requires actual knowledge for that one. But that's all under premise liability. You still have to be worried about any type of just plain negligence suits too.
Now, do medical professionals have a higher duty of care in connection with these premises liability claims, such as hospitals or doctor's offices?
Under the law, they treat those places the same for premise liability purposes. But for COVID-19, we know that CDC, OSHA, certain organizations have released stricter guidelines for hospitals. So they do have a higher standard of care for what they do when patrons come in versus a restaurant or an accountant or something like that. So under the law, they don't have a higher standard of care, but for premise liability, they don't have any type of different standard. It's still whether a dangerous condition existed and whether they knew or should have known. But again, the should have known part is going to be higher because they have all these other guidelines that CDC makes them follow.
Now, what kind of requirements can a property owner put on their tenants and the employees, guests, invitees, and licensees of the tenants? For example, can they require all of those people to wear masks, to take their temperature, to have other PPE for the employees, invitees, and licensees?
The answer to that is under premise liability, sure. From a constitutional aspect, nobody's really challenged it yet. We don't know what those requirements, whether they're constitutionally allowed. There's some talk in Kansas, for instance, on the mandate that some of the local cities may decide to challenge that particular ordinance. So from a practical
But if you're
standpoint,
talking about just a private entity,
correct.
The constitutional requirements wouldn't really even come into play, would they?
It depends. It depends on how it's used, right? And so from a high level standpoint, if you require all patrons to come in and wear masks, there shouldn't really be a constitutional issue there. But from a premise liability standpoint, a property owner, if they want to make sure that they're protected from liability, they should definitely follow the guidelines that CDC and OSHA have issued regarding temperature checks, masks, social distancing, putting up proper placards or warning signs, those kind of things.
Now let's flip it around. If you're a tenant in a multi-tenant building, can you go to your landlord and say, hey, shouldn't all of the tenants and all of their employees, invitees, and licensees be required to have masks, to take temperatures, to have PPE for their employees, invitees, and licensees?
So under premise liability, tenants don't have that type of power. But from a practical standpoint, they have a lot of ammunition that they can use to go to, whether it's their landlord, whether it's their boss, whether it's just a business owner and you don't feel comfortable going in there, they can go and bring them these guidelines and say, hey, Kansas or Kansas City have a mask mandate. Why aren't you following that? From a standpoint there, you can report those businesses to the health department. I think that's what they're doing in Kansas City and Kansas. The health department will enforce that mandate. You can show them the CDC and OSHA guidelines and say, hey, this is what needs to be followed. Employees have a different type of route that they can go because they are protected by OSHA. And you could probably have a 30-minute or an hour long or maybe longer conversation on the requirements of OSHA employees. So I think you need to carve out employees differently as far as what they can make their employers do, because they do have certain requirements under the law.
How have other diseases been handled as to these kind of premises liability issues? I mean, I'm sure that COVID-19 certainly is new for everybody, but I assume there have been some other diseases in the past, whether it's typhoid, whether it's measles outbreaks, whatever. How have those kinds of things been handled?
So what I've tried to look at when looking at COVID-19 type liability is, what can this kind of be like? What lawsuits would have been brought on a regular basis so that we have a good body of law to look at? And really what you look at is, one, kind of food poisoning outbreaks, right? Or E. coli type outbreaks. Or two, you've seen case law resulting of cruise ships when you have stomach bugs that kind of spread around cruise ships really fast. And again, it all goes back to the causation aspect of it all. Can you trace it back to that particular restaurant, that particular boat, that particular facility where they made, where they packaged the lettuce? And really, it's still a simple negligence analysis, but you can see that the tracing aspect of it is going to be the most difficult and hardest part to prove.
Now, with respect to liability issues, do owners or tenants' insurance liability policies typically cover these kinds of COVID-related claims? In other words, not so much for lost business, but for if they were to get sued for liability.
So most CGL policies are accident or occurrence type policies. And it really is just going to depend on the language of your policy. It very well could. I've had clients where you had food poisoning outbreaks and they were covered by their CGL policy. So it truly does depend on the language of it. There hasn't been a ton of litigation yet on that aspect. Most of it has been on the business interruption aspect of an insurance policy, just because there hasn't been a lot of lawsuits yet where restaurants or business owners are getting sued and they need a CGL policy to cover it. So I'm sure it's coming down the pike, and it really will be dependent on what the policy says itself. But I definitely think as you reopen, you should contact your insurance broker and make sure there isn't an exclusion in there for some type of disease like COVID-19, whether it's specifically mentioned now or whether it's kind of a broader exclusion. You need to make sure that it is included if you want it in there.
Right. Are there any other best practices you can think of that property owners and tenants should consider as buildings reopen?
Sure. So like I said at the beginning, OSHA, CDC, FDA for restaurants, they all have kind of an ever-changing toolkit on their websites that are really, really helpful to look at as you reopen. Some of them are industry specific, some are not. Some may not make sense for you, but some may. But I think as a property owner, you do have an obligation to look at those guidelines and make sure you know what fits and what doesn't fit. I mean, most people now are probably going to say in a jury pool, you probably should have required masks, at least for your employees. Maybe you don't want to require your patrons to wear it because you don't want to have incidences like they've had at some places where patrons either try to be verbally assaultive at employees or physically assaultive. But that's a decision you need to make. Is it worth it to you to still have your patrons wear masks? Do you want to have social distancing markers, little X's? If you're a coffee shop, do you want to have little X's all over to make sure all your customers are 6 feet apart? Do you want to have signs on your table saying this table cannot be sat at because it would be too close and violate social distancing? Do you want to require temperature checks? There's all kinds of considerations that need to be followed. And if you have bigger facilities like a manufacturing facility, a distribution center where you have hundreds and hundreds of employees, those considerations are even greater.
What other potential liability issues do property owners or tenants face and need to worry about as the economy opens up and people return to work?
So what we've been seeing so far is we've seen some cases where employees got COVID-19 and they're trying to take it out of workers' compensation. So states like Missouri and Kansas and most states in the United States have what they call workers' comp exclusivity, meaning if you get hurt on the job, you have to go into workers' comp. You can't bring it in a normal civil court. Well, what most employees are doing are trying to get around that workers' comp exclusivity, and every state has different exceptions. So you need to be on the lookout for that. You have all kinds of employment law lawsuits that are coming out right now, whether it's FMLA, that you weren't compensated because you got sick with COVID-19, that you were treated differently because you had COVID-19. Some litigation that we've seen starting is also what's called public nuisance, which is different from private nuisance. Private nuisance is often seen as I have a 5 alpaca on my property. The neighbor next to me thinks those alpaca really stink and are lowering the value of my property. That's private nuisance. Public nuisance, and what has been argued in some other cases, and some public nuisance cases have already been brought against companies like McDonald's, argue that, okay, so you didn't take the proper precautions at McDonald's. All your employees there weren't properly protected. They then went out into the community and spread COVID-19. That's a public nuisance because now you endanger the entire public. So that's another thing that you'll have to be aware of as a business owner, especially a business owner who may own multiple franchises or have a lot of employees, is your liability may not only be limited to your own patrons and your own employees, but if you do have a massive outbreak and those patrons or employees go out into the public and it leads to big community spread, it may be a public nuisance lawsuit as well.
Have any lawsuits been filed on these kinds of things yet with regard to property owners or tenants?
We haven't seen many tenant lawsuits yet. I mean, most of the tenant lawsuits involve, I couldn't pay my rent because of COVID-19, that type of thing. There are lawsuits that have been filed, mainly against big corporations that have big distribution centers or manufacturing facilities or meat processing facilities, where, whether it's a wrongful death claim because an employee got COVID-19 and they're claiming the proper precautions weren't used, whether it's a hospital where the nurses claim they didn't have the proper PPE. So they're starting to trickle in. There's not a ton of them yet. But as the economy starts to reopen, we definitely see that it's ripe for litigation, and the places that kind of stayed open already are getting sued. And so when you have this new reopening of the economy, the plaintiffs bar may target smaller places that open up too.
Any kind of, to conclude, is there anything else you think property owners or tenants should worry about and focus on as their businesses start opening up and the economy starts heating up again?
I just think it's an ever-changing landscape. So don't assume what you read last week as a guideline is the guideline this week. Make sure that you're regularly checking the CDC and the OSHA guidelines, making sure that you're doing what you need to do. I mean, originally when OSHA's guidelines came out, they weren't all that worried about smaller employees or employers, but now they're virtually requiring everybody to follow the OSHA guidelines now. And they'll still be exercise considerable discretion when they're doing it because they realize how difficult it is to trace COVID-19 and determine whether it's a work-related injury or not. But you do have obligations now that you didn't probably have 2 months ago. And so you just need to be apprised on not only what's happening on the federal level, but what's happening on the state level too. If your state or your local ordinance are requiring certain things, you need to be aware of that as well.
Well, very good. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. I think this has been very helpful, and you're clearly very knowledgeable about this whole area of law. Thank you again. This was
Thank
great.
you. Thank you.